Okay, so you guys are being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, leave now because everything else is going on. Say, hey, all of my Trojans out there, class, my Force 508 class. As I told you last week and the week before, we really want to not only go through the curriculum for what we're doing, but we also want to find opportunities to bring outside people in, outside individuals that share passions for what we're doing, that share a love and a life for this type of work, and that can give you much better insight than I can. Well, a little bit better than I can. I won't diminish myself too much. But tonight, we have, by special request, a very special guest brought in. Her name is Jennifer Susko. And what I will say, I came up with this long intro and everything wonderful to say about her, but I think the greatest compliment I can give to her will resonate with many of you. She is a school counselor. And I don't say that to diminish. I say that to really celebrate, because as we learned in our very first lesson when we did the town hall meeting, there's so much to being a school counselor that is almost an obligation. And I say that in a positive sense. There's no negative to that. But these are the things and the qualities that should exist in a school counselor. And I always talk to you guys about, you future counselors, this is what we're trying to do. But we have a counselor with us, and she is, in every sense of the word, a school counselor. And I'm very happy to have you with us today. Jennifer, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for that welcome. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's a really big honor. I appreciate it.
The honor is all on this side of the screen, or the technology, however you want to be it. If you could, if all my people had videos up, they would be doing this. They would be finger snapping, celebrating and thanking you for being here today. I just want to jump right into it. So let's just see how good we can do at having a conversation. We had one earlier, and so I'm a little ahead of you guys. I got a little chance to spend a little time with her. But let's just start with who you are and your background and how you got to this point.
Okay, so I am a school counselor, and David, you told me that I don't have to go back to elementary school, but to tell my story and how I got to be who I am and where I am, I do have to go back to fourth grade. I was in fourth grade when the Rodney King riots happened in Los Angeles, and that was videotaped, which when I was in fourth grade, we didn't have social media. We didn't have things typically videoed like you all have now, or like we all have now. But I saw the riots. I knew what happened to Rodney King, and the police brutality and the racism that was involved in that. And it really upset me, even as a 9-year-old. I didn't fully understand, obviously, the reasons why, but I was so emotionally moved and upset by that I wrote a letter in pencil to my governor at the time. Zell Miller was the governor of Georgia. So I wrote him a letter about how we need to stop the racism, and that he needed to do something about that, even though he was not necessarily the right person to go to. As a 9-year-old, that's all I knew. I had Black friends in my class, and I just was so deeply hurt by that incident. And so that began my journey towards fighting for racial justice and starting to study it. And I really had to be self-taught. There wasn't a ton of information. My educators were not teaching me about that. So definitely got a lot wrong along the way, all the way up even until college, trying to figure out what is happening systemically in society. Why is it like this? But all throughout that, I maintained my passion for racial and social justice. And as I was considering careers and what I wanted to do, I knew I wanted to work with children. I knew I wanted to work in mental health. So I thought about school counseling. And when I saw the job description, and particularly the ethics, the ethical standards that school counselors are held to, even though they've changed and evolved a lot and gotten much better. Even when I was starting grad school, there was always an emphasis from ASCA, the American School Counselors Association, on social justice, and you were to be a social justice advocate if you were a school counselor, and you were also to be fighting for systemic change within your schools and communities so that all kids could succeed. So all of my interests and wanting to make sure that marginalized kids were able to succeed, as well as all other students or all other kids, that just became the perfect career for me to be able to do that without really, I didn't think, being asked why, but that changed later.
You know, that's a phenomenal backstory. It's amazing how things can trigger us at such a young age. I really like the fact that you said you wrote a letter in pencil, not even knowing if it's the right person, but it started you down this pathway. Now you mentioned that oh man, I'm losing it. You mentioned that as you looked into your role in your career and what it was going to be, the different things that you were required to be. And so this class, our introduction to you was through the town hall that we got to see, talking about racism in schools. And we had a very long discussion about a number of the guest speakers, particularly you. And then someone in our class said, I think she resigned. Was like, okay, that was kind of a drop the mic moment, because wow, she's doing this amazing work, and you were very vocal and conscientious about what you were saying, but still saying the right things, the things at least that people needed to hear, not what people necessarily wanted to hear. And then we found out you resigned. Can you talk about that at all and what led to that? Because that takes a lot of passion to just say, I'm out. I got to go do something else.
Yeah. So I resigned in protest of a ban on critical race theory and using the 1619 Project in my school district. And this was a district that I had worked for 6 years as an elementary school counselor, off and on for about 10 years. I had left and come back and done some high school counseling in Cobb County. But for the 6 years that I was an elementary school counselor, I was doing the advocacy that we are supposed to do. We had many, many incidents of racial trauma, outright racism, overt racism, implicit bias, just tons of examples where Black and brown students were being harmed. And so along with a coalition of other school counselors, community members, I was doing the advocacy that we are supposed to do to try to break down those obstacles. I was going to school board meetings. I was meeting with parents. It was never just me. We were doing that for many years before any of this divisive concepts legislation started. And we actually saw some progress. There were some changes from our advocacy. We were advocating for culturally relevant pedagogy, for teachers to be trained in that, for anti-bias, anti-racist training across the district. We did get some level of that. So we were making progress. And the way that we were speaking, like you said, it wasn't what people wanted to hear, but it was what people needed to hear. And then things started to get worse after 2020. At first it was like, okay, this racial reckoning, we want to do better in all of the surrounding counties. But my county was just very staunchly like, we're not having an anti-racism resolution. We're not doing any of this. So that was like, okay, we're still going to fight this battle. We're still going to do this. And it started to get worse with Black kids being called the N-word in the middle of their high school, and then going to leaders in the school board and saying, listen, this is what's happening to us. And can you help us? This is what we want to happen. Teachers were saying things like to Hispanic students that they were going to throw them over Trump's wall, that Black students would meet the four wheels of their tires. And this is the type of things that we're going and we're advocating. We're saying, hey, this is not okay. We're school counselors. This is racial trauma. This is harming the mental health. We were giving studies, we were giving research, we were sharing all of the information in a very diplomatic way. But once you get to a certain point, it becomes, if you've ever been to Cobb County, the racism, it just became stagnant, and it was getting worse and worse with no response. And as we were advocating and fighting that, the divisive concept stuff started. So our county decided, before even the legislature said you can't talk about this anymore, they decided to pass the ban. So none of them could define critical race theory. It was just, we don't want y'all talking about this anti-racism stuff anymore. We don't want these students coming here telling us what they're hearing, what's happening to them. So we're going to pass this ban. And I had been told by multiple people at very high levels that I would be disciplined using that ban. And prior to that, I didn't have any disciplinary history. I had done pretty well, won some awards, but this was now going to be a policy in place. I use critical race theory very openly, and I would not have lasted. And even the summer before, right before I resigned, I got a disciplinary letter from my principal. We weren't even in school, and it said, you use this theory, this ban is now in place in this county, so you are now being insubordinate. And anytime that you are talking about this or advocating for this, this will come up, just be aware of that. So at that point, I decided to write my letter of resignation. And if you read my letter, it's really long, so maybe you don't want to, but the last line is, see you soon. And somebody mentioned, and maybe we'll talk about it later, leaving my students. I certainly did not leave my students in Cobb County. I'm at every school board meeting. I am still working with the Black student unions there. I work with many student organizers in Cobb. I'm still in the media there, as always, criticizing the district and bugging them because I wasn't going to leave them. But it was to a point where my advocacy was simply going to be shut down and I was going to be fired. So there comes a point where you have to make some tough decisions. And I loved my job, absolutely would have retired at that school, would have stayed in elementary school counseling, loved it. But to do that, to stay there, I would have had to stop the work that I was doing or try to do it and get away with it. And there just wasn't a path forward for me.
I get that. So two things. If you supply me a link or email me your resignation letter, I can pretty much guarantee 13 students who would love to read it. I shouldn't speak for them. Maybe you can ask them when you get to talk to them. But
Okay.
you mentioned a ban on critical race theory. Now, I understand critical race theory. Many of my students do, but this video may fall in the hands of someone at some point who thinks they know or who has no idea. So to coin a phrase from one of my favorite movies, Philadelphia, Denzel Washington says, explain it to me like I'm a 4-year-old. What's critical race theory?
Okay, I don't know if I can explain it like you're a 4-year-old because it's extremely complex. And even, you probably know Kimberly Crenshaw, who is one of the scholars who created it, says, it can't really be confined to a static or narrow definition. It's more of a verb. But in terms of definition, it's an academic and legal framework that basically posits that systemic racism is embedded in our American society. So from education, housing, healthcare, employment, all of those disparities that we see between Black and brown people and white people in those areas, I appreciate and study the theory because it's the best explanation I've found for why we have those disparities. And it's just a theory noting that racism is more than just individual bias or one person who's prejudiced, but it is embedded in our laws, our policies, our institutions, and all of those things uphold these racial inequalities. And it has several tenets and explains through those tenets societal issues that before I couldn't understand why Black Americans had a higher mortality rate or outsized exposure to police violence, the school to prison pipeline, all those things. I didn't understand until I started to read critical race theory and the explanation of systemic racism being embedded in all of those parts of our society.
Yeah, you're right. I think that's a little complicated for a 4-year-old, but I got it. And
Yeah. I don't think I could explain
explained it a lot better than I could. Again, I've spent many years in critical race theory and understanding the concepts. I like what you said, though. You said that it's not about the person, the individual person who may or may not be racist, but it also doesn't stop because an individual person says they're not racist. Well, this doesn't apply because I'm not a racist person. Well, it has so little to do with you as much as the system that we're all in. So I really appreciate that thought. I really want to give space for my students. But one last question, and then we'll open it up. You started this conversation talking about mental health on some degree, and that's just a huge buzzword. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but we're always addressing mental health now, much more so than before. You mentioned you were in fourth grade when you saw the Rodney King incident. I was in college. All right, so that kind of tells you the breakdown of where we are. But in your own personal life, and I've been tracking you a little bit and looking at some of the things we face. I don't know if I shared it with you guys, but when I originally reached out to Jennifer, she says, well, this is what I'm dealing with. And I shared that with you. And she said, if you still want to talk to me after this, reach out. And so I did, you did, so we did. But in that, you've been slapped with a lot of labels, painted with some ugly paintbrushes. And as an individual, your mental health, not necessarily I'm concerned for your mental health, but I imagine you have strategies of how do you maintain who you are, what you do, and more importantly, how you do it through all of these labels that are thrown at you.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I think doing the work in general is why I need to manage my mental health. Those labels that were thrown at me by the white supremacist organization, that hurts me only in that it stalls the work that needs to be done for racial justice. It means zero to me that those people are saying the things that they are saying. Being called racist by white people means nothing to me. And what they pulled were things that I'm proud that I said. It was all public stuff. But it does really, really get me upset that I do trainings on this. I teach other school counselors how to do it. And then when they see stuff like that, it's like, oh, I don't want to go through that. I don't want to be doxxed. I've had people share where I live, and that part is what's hard for me, that counselors will see what's happening to me and say, oh, wait a minute, this is not a risk level that I'm willing to endure. And that weighs on me very heavily, that the work would stall because of that. And so in terms of self-care and managing that, I don't do a great job with it. I'll just be upfront about that. But the things that help me most are talking to my friends and colleagues who do this work, because they understand and know, the depths of emotion that you can feel, and being able to just feel safe to share with them. And then in my living room, I have a framed picture of Malcolm X, quotes by Angela Davis, James Baldwin, and looking at following the model of freedom fighters who came before me and Black feminists who I've learned from, and seeing what they've gone through way beyond anything that I've had to experience, is super helpful for me. Just Fannie Lou Hamer and, huge just things that they've endured, is just really motivational and inspirational to me. Anytime I might feel like, oh, this is getting too tough, it's really pretty quick for me to look at a picture, read something that they've said, and feel like, okay, there are people propping me up and who have made this road easier. And I want to, in a sense, make them proud. And I can certainly continue on if they did.
Excellent. Well, I will say to you, as much as I involve myself in the things that I do, different places I go, I always look for soldiers, people that are in the battle with me. And there's some where I say, why don't you sit this one out? And there are some where I just say, hey, I'm glad to have you by my side. So for you, I'll choose the latter. I'm glad to have you by my side. Thank you for all that you've shared. And I look forward to more continued conversations. I always tell my students, now's your time to start typing in the chat, by the way, you guys. But I always tell my students that this class has so little to do with me. This is really you guys' class, and I want it to be advantageous for them. So if any of you have any questions, any thing you want to have, and I know a lot of you posted them on there, I'm happy to operate on your behalf, but she would love to meet you. You might want to meet her. So if you have any questions, please, now's your opportunity. Jennifer is ready and ready to talk to you. So who wants to go first?
Just put my resignation letter in the chat, David, for you, just FYI.
Okay. I think they can all see that as well.
I had a question.
Okay. That's Sarah.
Yes.
All right. So introduce yourself, please. Let me get you on here. There you go.
Oh.
So
Hi, my name is Sarah, but there's two Sarahs in this class, so I told Dr. Dasser to call me by my nickname, which is Swoo, which is my first initial and my last name. But yeah, nice to meet you. My question was, you mentioned how ethics was what you were drawn to and what really got you into this school counseling. But me personally, so I'm taking ethics right now, and it's just so much. Like there's just so many gray areas. There, of course, there's that black and white, and there are the code of ethics, and there's the Ask a National Law and all that stuff. But how do you implement, like really implement the ACA code of ethics and ASCA like into your work, and like how do you make those distinguishable decisions?
Yeah, so that's tough, because when you are in the practice of school counseling is when you have to make those determinations based on situations that come up with your students, right? And I'm sure you've heard this from your professors, and it is very true. The answer is always it depends on what you should do, whether it's, you should do this or you should do that. But whenever there is a tricky situation that comes up, I definitely consult the ASCA ethical standards. Usually in practice, it is more helpful to consult because you have colleagues who are school counselors who you can ask, but I always will look at the ethics if it's not something that I just remember. But in the ethics, it says, if you don't have a good enough answer, consult. So ask, the school counselors who are around you. And as far as when I say ethics pulled me into this work, it's the social justice piece and the systemic change piece was in the preamble of the ethical standards. So it's like, okay, I know this is work that I want to do, but I would not survive without the ethical standards to guide me through those difficult situations. And it is gray. It just is. But it gives you a really good foundation for, like, you shouldn't have a dual role. If your cousin is your student, that you should probably not be their school counselor. Like, certain things are black and white, but the ethics will give you a foundation to then consult. But a tool that is one of my favorites ever to use to put some weight behind anti-racism work and diversity, equity, and inclusion work in school counseling are the position statements. I don't know if y'all have seen those, but they're branches of the ethical standards on specific topics. So like LGBTQ youth and the school counselor will be a position statement, and it's ASCA's entire position on where we stand and what we should be doing. That also exists for the school counselor and anti-racism, which is included in my letter of resignation. I ended with that because my district often recognized ramp schools. So you're giving awards to recognize ASCA model programs. The school counselor and anti-racism position statement is what ASCA says we should do. So you're criminalizing this work over here, but you're also awarding it. So you have the weight of the profession behind you when you use those ethics. But if y'all haven't already, I would highly encourage you just Google ASCA position statements, because it gives you a little bit more clarity on what to do with those like kind of controversial issues.
Thank you, Swoo. Any other questions you have? All right, she was our bold first go. While someone else is getting ready, I have a question from someone. They said, every kid needs a champion, and I find that sharing my personal experiences with others helps to build trust in the relationship. But as a counselor, is that ethical, or does it cross boundaries?
I think, unfortunately, that is, again, it depends. It depends how much you are sharing, but certainly to a degree that is okay. But you would be right to have some hesitancy with doing that too much, and you learn that balance once you get into the job. And it also depends on the developmental age of the student, how much you would share about yourself. And that is also an area where if you feel some hesitancy or you feel like maybe this is too much, consulting your colleagues, consulting your supervisor in those situations is advisable. But it's not always that you should not ever share any part of you with your students.
I find that one day I might get in a lot of trouble for that. I think that's a very effective method of building trust and relationships.
Absolutely.
So I think that's good. All right, anybody want to go next? I have another question I can sub with. There we go. All right, so we have Sarah Goldstein. Let me put her on the screen. Go here, and there we go. Sarah, you're live and in color, wearing purple. Go for it.
I also have a very catchy nickname. It's Goldstein. It's not. Good to see you. Good to have you. So my question is, I guess it concerns both you and your experience as a counselor, but I guess it kind of also goes beyond and kind of in general, having those difficult conversations, especially with other white folks. I think like inherently in doing anti-racist work, I think the phrase is you're going to ruffle some feathers. It's inherent in the work. And yet I have seen with folks in my life who tend to more center on inflammatory, potentially antagonizing and othering language, that I've seen third parties in the conversation shut down. They get defensive, they shut down. So I guess, obviously, like I said, there's no way to do this work without offending or upsetting someone. Because also, if you want to be offended by something, you're going to be offended by it. How do you balance doing the work, saying the statements that are going to make people uncomfortable, that will probably make people angry, at least some people make them angry, while also trying to really like call people in? I love that phrase ever since I heard it. Instead of just calling people out, but also calling people in, building solidarity with the movement, with this anti-racist work. How do you balance that? And of course, you're going to have folks, just like a lot of people at COP, it seems like, who there's nothing you can do to call them in. There's zero. There's no honey or sweetness you could do to let them have them agree with you. But for those folks who are in the middle, who you can maybe convince or sway, or at least have them rethink some things, where do you find that balance?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. It's super tough. But for me, and I am operating on what you said with that, there are just some cases where you must call out. That's where I operate from. But in these cases where you could maybe call these folks in, I think having some norms is helpful. There are different frameworks that you can use. Courageous conversations is one, but where you establish before you start the conversation, like, here's what we're going to do. Like, we're going to be able to sit in our discomfort, whatever they are. We're going to be able to talk about race. We're going to be able to, have non-closure. We may leave not agreeing, but I think if you're able, I know you're not always in a setting to do that. But if you can, and if you can build a relationship with those people and then say, like, can we have this conversation, but let's establish some norms before we go into it, because we know that this is difficult work. I find that can be helpful.
That makes a lot of sense, kind of creating a safe space in a way. There's actually, there's a group within, I think it's within Surge, showing up for racial justice.
Yeah, we have that here too.
White People for Black Lives. And at first when I heard that, I was like, ooh, that does not sound good. But realistically,
isn't it Matt McGorry's like Matt McGorry does that, or he's part of
Maybe,
it?
honestly, I only went to a few of those.
Okay. He's a
But-
celebrity and he always posts about that.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Wow.
he's in How to
Well,
Get
it
Away
is
with
about-
Murder, and anyway.
Oh no, just yeah, it's about creating a space where folks do feel comfortable confronting this stuff and like feeling safe and like they're not going to offend anyone or say something wrong. So in a setting like that, that's fantastic using that language. I imagine for most folks who need to hear this stuff the most, you're not going to find yourself in a situation like that where you can kind of make it a courageous conversation.
Yeah.
In that case, kind of in the wild, if you're hearing stuff that you think could be an opportunity to call someone in, how do you, and then, you know, I'll move off this, but how would you approach something like that? Whether it's just your friend, a colleague, they say something and you catch it and you're like, this is a great moment. How do you balance, like I said, you know, not calling them out, but, you know, bringing it up, making them potentially feel uncomfortable while also not alienating them?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think of the work setting, this is something that happens where colleagues will say something and I know that I need to say something because it's, you know, something harmful to kids. And I usually try to lean on empathy and pulling out of them kind of like, what did you mean by that? And sort of having them talk through that a little bit more. And then getting to the place where I can ask them, how do you think that might make XYZ person feel? Once I've kind of asked them to elaborate on, because if you kind of gently push people, maybe they don't realize, a lot of times I find they don't realize what the implication is of what they're saying. They don't know the historical background. So kind of getting them to answer, you know, can you tell me more about what you mean by that? And then sharing, well, you know, do you mind if I share with you, you know, some historical background where you might not want to, you know, you would understand why that could be hurtful. Would that be okay? And that is kind of how I approach it at work.
No, I think that's actually a great balance between opening the conversation, asking for consent to kind of further that conversation. I like that. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. It's a good one.
Thanks, Goldstein. All right, who's next? I have another question. Oh, okay, let me have another. This question comes from Brittany. There she is. Let me get her in the screen. Brittany, go ahead and introduce yourself to Jennifer and ask your question. You're muted.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Well, hi.
Hi, Brittany.
I'm Brittany King. I really appreciate you being here. I had a question. It kind of stems from one of our essential questions that we have every week. And it was like, can you basically encourage well-being in an unjust system, like basically teaching kids just to cope with injustices? And so my question is like, obviously I'm Black, so I've been in situations in school where, you know, I've basically all my life, people have taught us, you're going to be discriminated. You got to just keep pushing through. You got to keep pushing through. You got to learn how to just cope with it. But my question is for like kids, like as the example you gave with your students where they were being called the N-word and the higher up, like administration wasn't doing anything. What do you do in that? Like, what advice do you have for us? Because at some point, I don't want to keep telling kids to cope with it because that's horrible. And and for me, it was a horrible experience. So, my question is like, what can we do? Like, I know it's a broad question, but that's my question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have a different answer for you as a Black person than I do, you know, and I acknowledge my positionality as a white woman here, just, you know, so any Black people on the call want to correct me or say something to me, please do so. But in this situation, you obliterate the system. You absolutely do not ask children to cope with this. And so systemic change, that's where you're changing that. And that's where you're trying to fight that. And that's what I saw in the ethics that made me want to be a school counselor. It's like, no, we don't just tell them that this system is what it is and we need to just get through it. We change it. And so for an example, you often hear things like, oh, how to teach kids resiliency and grit. And maybe you just go to professional development on that for school counselors, right? Over and over. And it's like, wait a minute, Black kids don't need to be taught grit. Like and this comes from Dr. Bettina Love, who is an abolitionist. She has a book called We Want to Do More Than Survive. And she talks about how Black students should be able to thrive and live in liberation and joy in education and just getting rid of the whole system. So we don't need to be teaching Black kids grit or self-control. If you're doing a lesson on self-control, there is also an ASCA mindset and behavior standard to assert yourself when necessary. So I make sure, and I teach my Black and brown kids, like, you maybe don't need to show self-control in certain situations. You maybe need to assert yourself, and let me help you do that. If you feel like a teacher is treating you a certain way, let's practice how you would assert yourself and how you would, respond to that. And so I'm making sure, like, decolonizing what we're just given as like, oh, growth mindset, resiliency, grit. Like, no, wait a minute, that isn't what we're doing here. We need to change the system. And when I go to the school board now in Cobb County, I don't operate as a school counselor anymore. I mean, I did a bunch of like fighting the system and trying to change that. And we did see some progress. And when that progress stopped and got worse, which is what those students are doing still now that I described, I am not speaking as a school counselor. So if you hear any of my public comments, it is like, we have to get rid of this leadership. I'm canvassing right now for a school board candidate that, if she wins, will fire the superintendent in Cobb County, and that will trickle down into huge systemic change. But I had to even get out of my role as a school counselor because it can't even be done professionally at this point in the type of racism that we are experiencing. But focusing on the affecting systemic change portion of what it means to be a school counselor. And so making sure that you are following the ethics with anti-racism and all the intersectionalities of students, and absolutely not asking them to cope. And there's lots of resources, but highly encourage Dr. Bettina Love and abolitionist educators, because they are teaching us how to abolish systems that would tell Black and brown kids, you just got to deal with this, because that is absolutely not what we have to do. So from our point of view as school counselors, we're doing that. We're fighting the systemic change. And then we are also empowering the kids to do it with us. Somebody should have been with you, helping you obliterate what you were going through, but also empowering you to speak up as well, and going with you if you were willing to do that, or asking you what you thought the solution was. Like, we have to talk to our kids, center their voices around those exact issues, and center the voices of those who are impacted. Like, what do they think? What do their parents think? Forming coalitions to stand up and make sure that we change that system.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate that answer.
Thanks, Brittany. We have one more question in the chat. I want to add a piece to that. I often talk about, does a fish know it's wet? And you mentioned that speaking as a school counselor, there was limited. You were chained. That's my word, not yours. But there's limited opportunities for you to do what's necessary to make that change. But now that role, at least in Cobb County, isn't on you, it actually empowers you to do so much more, because you're not limited by the process. And so that's a question I want to come back to. We had another question in the chat. It said, are you currently employed as a school counselor outside of Cobb County, or are you focusing your professional energy on activism and advocacy within Cobb?
Both. I am employed outside Cobb County. I'm a high school counselor in a nearby district that emphasizes anti-racism, abolishing white supremacy. That's all on their district website. So I'm doing that, but as I said, the last line of my resignation letter was "see you soon," because I absolutely wasn't going to leave Cobb County. I live in Cobb County. I went to school in Cobb County, all Cobb schools. So my advocacy continues, and will continue. Hopefully, election day, things will change. Been canvassing, knocking on doors for this candidate since July, thousands of doors. So that will continue. I will not ever stop my advocacy within COP, but I am also a school counselor.
Anyone else who has a question? We have about 10 minutes left for this Q&A session. Please either unmute yourself and say something or put it in the chat. In the meantime, the other point I was going to make with you regarding what you told Brittany about speaking up for yourself and advocating for yourself. A lot of times, if you tell that to me, it's like, okay, where, when, who, right? I'm a confrontational by nature, and for some people that's not an issue. For others, you might as well ask them to climb Mount Everest, because that is so anti in their personality. How do you either lead teams or encourage teams to do this work when confrontation isn't in their nature, or when they don't have the ability or the empowerment to resign in protest or to make aggressive actions, when they're actually limited by the system? How do you encourage them?
Yeah, I always would tell everyone just to maximize your own skill set. I mean, I have a certain skill set. My colleagues and friends and other activists have skill sets that I do not have. And that is, so if you're not going to speak at public comment, you're not going to go to the school board, or you're not going to organize a protest, there's so many other things that you can do. And some that remain completely behind the scenes and no one would ever know that you're doing them. But it is much needed work. So I would just always advise or encourage folks to lean on what they are good at, because we all have strengths, and it's not better or worse that you're not comfortable doing something publicly, as long as you are doing something, because there are some school counselors who are doing nothing, and that's the only thing that isn't okay, is to do nothing.
Well, they're helping people with college exams and school classes. Just kidding. All right. I do, and I'm going to allow Sarah. Sarah has one more question. Sarah Goldstein. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi. So I did not submit this because I did not think of it at the time. But I'm curious, and I feel like it's consistent with general, it depends. But I'm curious your personal balance of, doing the work in a way that takes some of the burden of the work off of people of color who are like living this, and almost like being proactive, just taking the responsibility on yourself, while also not inserting yourself where, for lack of a better term, you're not wanted, or other, not speaking for anyone. How do you it's going to depend on the situation. It's going to depend on each person, what they're comfortable with. But how do you personally approach that? Because I know you spoke a little bit about that in the town hall. I think you said something along the lines of, I wasn't going to show up, but someone asked me to, and like I listened. So what is your kind of general personal thought thinking around that?
Yeah, I think number one is excuse me, not to center, I'm saying yourself, I don't know how you identify, but for me, not to center yourself as a white person is number one. So, and not to get into white saviorism. And there's a balance there, and it comes with practice. And you're going to get it wrong sometimes. And then when you get it wrong, you just are going to apologize for getting it wrong and move on from it, and not get all caught up in like guilt or, okay, I can't do it again because I messed up. But I just find a balance between, I don't want to center myself, I don't want to take up space. And then I have Black friends and colleagues and parents and students who say, we want you to do this, so do it. And so then absolutely I'm doing it. But you get the feel for when your voice is not needed, and you can pass the mic, or you can sit there silently, or you can do something completely in the background. A lot of times at protests and things like that, the media will immediately come to me, to a white person. And so it is, that is just like, it's almost always black and white there. It's like, no, go to the black and brown people who are impacted by this. Like, some things are just, that is what you do every single time. There's not any reason to be talking to me, at this. But when it's other stuff like the town hall, I didn't want to center myself, and I didn't want to take up space. But the black school counselors and counselor educators were saying the field is majority white women, so we need to hear from white women doing this work. It needs to be you. So building relationships with the impacted communities in your life, black and brown people, LGBTQ people, minoritized groups, so that you can just openly have these conversations. It isn't something that I'm nervous about asking. The communities where I work, they know where I'm coming from. So it's a question that I can ask, and like, where am I best used? What do you want me to be doing? And yeah, then it just comes with practice, and especially building those relationships. You have to have like the grassroots kind of organizer that comes from groups like Surge. You learn in those organizations kind of how to ask those questions and how to make sure that most of the time you get it right.
So, build relationships in community, listen, amplify, and
Ask. Yeah. Should I be doing this? Is this wrong?
Thanks, Sarah. Another question from the chat. I'm not sure how much experience you have with the private school era, but within public schools, if you see an injustice, there's paths you can take. There's a school board, there's a hierarchy of different things you can do. Private schools tend to operate a little differently. Is there any advice you can give to a counselor who maybe works in a private school environment, who publicly witnesses either situationally or as a matter of practice injustices amongst the students? What would her path be? What would their path be to address those issues?
Yeah, so my advice would be limited here, just because I have zero experience in the private school system. But what I would always say is, don't do anything by yourself. Collaborate and find a group of people who are understanding of what you're seeing, and who will form a coalition with you to bring this to awareness. So whether it's parents in the community of the impacted students, a lot of times for me, it's teachers. I mean, social studies teachers have been my allies, not wanting history to be censored. So finding a group of people so that you are not doing this by yourself is the best advice that I can give. I don't know how to navigate that system because I haven't been in it, just don't know it that well. But I do know that you would not want to do anything without a coalition of people and building consensus around that this injustice is happening.
Excellent. I agree 100%. Our time is running a little short. I promised I would get you out of here. Just in case you guys don't know, Jennifer's on the East Coast, and so it's a pretty late evening for her. One of the things that you and I had talked about before, jokingly, I said I try to make every interaction I have with people a positive interaction. And that is truly my intent. I should have done this at the beginning, but the students who are here tonight and those who couldn't make it are perhaps some of the greatest humans that I've ever had the opportunity to spend time with as a group. And I'm really engaged with them personally, and look forward to all that they will do as they take their rightful steps into being school counselors and all that means. And to my class, I had the opportunity to speak with Jennifer earlier. And from off the bat, what I'll share with you is that there's some people I know where they're not friends. And I would just say, this isn't a person you should be involved with. And there's some people where I would say, this is my friend. And when I use the emphasis on it means that I have a relationship with that person. If you need something, let me know and I'll work it out, right? Because they're not necessarily a friend to all. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but I believe Jennifer is our friend, and she's doing work that we strive to do, and a lot of it is for us to get outside of our comfort zones. A lot of it is to recognize that, one, we're never alone, and so there's always someone that's trying to pave that way before us. And sometimes it requires you to get uncomfortable as well, which we talk about in class a lot, and to get out of our own comfort zones, and to be advocates for those who don't have a voice or who don't know how to use their voice, and still do the right thing within the realms that we can. As Jennifer so excellently put, it's important to do something versus doing nothing at all. So on behalf of myself and all of my students, I just want to thank you for sharing this time with us and giving us your time, and more importantly, your wisdom and your heart. And with a few minutes to go, I would like to just turn the floor over to you for any final comments you'd like to make.
Well, thank you so much. That was lovely. I really appreciate it. And I absolutely hope that I can be y'all's friend. We say y'all here. But I have enjoyed this. The questions were wonderful. Thank you for asking me. Thank you for having me. It's super exciting to know that y'all will be school counselors, that the field is growing, and that you're as insightful and focused as you are. And I'm really honored that you let me come here and speak. So thank y'all so much.
It's our pleasure. Pleasure indeed. Anyone else? Just looking at some things in the chat. If anyone has any final hellos, goodbyes. I see some hand claps. I see more hand claps. Yes, they're very appreciative of you. So thank you so much. I see a heart. Lots of love from Education 508 from USC. So we thank you so much. I'll be in touch. I really
Okay,
will.
David, thank you. It was so lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you as well. You take care, Jennifer. We'll talk soon.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.